Welcome to Real Health with me, Carl Henry. Folks, today on the podcast, we're joined by Sophie Medlin, a consultant dietitian with clinical and medical experience. She focuses on evidence-based nutrition, gut health, and sustainable eating, helping listeners separate fact from fad and build practical habits that support both physical and mental well-being. Sophie, welcome to Real Health. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Let's get to know you a little bit, first of all, for our listeners. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your passions in health.
Yeah, so for people that don't know, dietitians are the medical nutrition people. So we go to university and learn the science of nutrition, but then we go on placements like doctors and nurses and learn how to apply that to medicine. So we go into hospitals, do placements, and work with individuals to understand how the science of nutrition can improve health outcomes and what we need to do to obviously optimize people's health, whether they're in hospital or out of hospital. I was really lucky to know I wanted to be a dietitian from the age of 15, and it's been a fantastic career. I worked in the NHS for 7 or 8 years, and then I was an academic for 5 years, and now I run my consultancy, which is City Dietitians. We see patients, I see many patients every week. I'm a consultant colorectal dietitian, and my friends would say that means I talk about colorectal. Yeah, I talk about butts and guts for a living. That's the truth of it. And I love it. I'm really passionate about it. I think anyone who's ever experienced bowel problems will know that it can be really life limiting and have a massive impact on people's quality of life. So improving that through my work is a real honor, and I'm so grateful to do the work that I do.
So that's dealing with things like Crohn's, IBS, that type of thing.
Yeah, Crohn's, other inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, microscopic colitis, as well as things like people who've had any kind of bowel surgery for any reason, including things like stoma bags, so colostomies, ileostomies, that kind of stuff. I also formulate supplements and do all sorts of interesting things outside of that work. And I've been lucky enough to do some TV work and radio work and things like that.
Amazing. And what happened when you were 15 that drew you to be a dietitian?
Well, I was studying catering at GCSE, and my catering teacher was a nutritionist. And we did this piece about, this just showing my age a bit here. We did this piece about swapping how you would reformulate someone's diet to go from, if they had celiac disease, so complete sort of sensitivity to gluten. And my catering teacher said, "Oh, I think you might enjoy looking at nutrition as a career." And I looked at it and I thought, well, if I'm a dietitian, I can work as a nutritionist or as a dietitian. Dietitians obviously are the only people that can work in the NHS. And I thought that looks like a good career path. So I looked into it and decided to be a dietitian, and yeah, the rest is history. 20 years later.
And I can see by chatting to you already, you've a, as we say here, a graw for it, or a love for what you do.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. So chat to me about a dietitian in the world that we live in. What are the mistakes you're seeing in clinic or all around you that people are making time and time again?
I mean, it's never ending, and every week it's something different, unfortunately. People are picking up, a lot of information from social media now, and we know from evidence that's been carried out, research that's been carried out, that 90% of the nutrition information on social media is false. So that's really helpful, and there's a constant battle for us as dietitians fighting against the misinformation that's out there. And I think that one of the real problems we have at the moment is that people feel like the sort of standard of nutrition that people are upholding on social media as being the right way of eating feels really unsustainable, really unmanageable for people. So lots of people don't make those small changes that could actually make a massive difference to their long-term health, quality of life, length of life, disease risk, and etc. Because we're shown this kind of shiny, perfect thing. If you're not doing ice baths and saunas and drinking all these expensive juices, then you can't be healthy. When of course that's just not the case. So yeah, it's a constant battle. There's always a new supplement that my patient tells me they've been convinced to buy on social media, etc. That maybe we haven't even heard of. So it's an interesting time.
Do you think people are more confused than ever before about health, wellness, and food and diet? Like people, they actually don't really know what to eat or how to cook it.
Yeah, completely. I think it's a real challenge for people, because even, some of the people who I work with in my clinic are some of the most educated people in the country. They're, people that, you might know the name of if I was able to tell you. They are people who are doing incredible jobs. So they've probably read everything before they've come to me, but they're equally confused as someone who is reading, a red top newspaper, who's getting mixed information all the time on whether they should be eating eggs or not eating eggs. And now we have the carnivores who are telling you not even to eat fruits and vegetables. So it's constant misinformation, drip feeding of misinformation to people all the time, that makes it seem like it's really complicated and difficult, when actually what I call the dinner lady dietetics, eating your fruits and vegetables, drinking more water, sleeping well, the basics are really the foundations of good health.
And what are the impacts from a gut perspective that you're seeing that are kind of presenting after people trying the fad diets, following the social media advice? Like, what are you seeing from on a gut perspective?
I think that the worst that we can do to our guts, and this sometimes happens because someone, for example, may have done a food intolerance test, which are completely non-evidence based, by the way. No one should ever take them. There's no evidence behind them being beneficial. People then cut out loads of things from their diet as a result of doing a test like that. And then they can end up with what I would call a microbiome injury. But the same sort of thing
Oh, I
can
like
happen.
that. Oh, say that again. That's lovely. That's very clever.
So when we cut things out of our diet, we can end up with what I call a microbiome injury, where gut bacteria have been killed off because we've not been eating certain foods for a long time, or populations of gut bacteria have shifted because of imbalance in our diet. That can also happen if you follow something like a keto diet and you cut out whole grain carbohydrates. That can also happen if you go on a meal replacement diet. That can obviously happen if you eat a diet that's full of ultra processed foods and you're not getting enough fiber and fruits and vegetables. If you follow a carnivore diet, it's a whole other disaster. So lots of people are going through periods of their life where things happen, their diet changes. Sometimes we can get a microbiome injury just from a period of acute or chronic stress. Sometimes it's from antibiotic use and things like that. But largely I see people who have gone through a period where they've cut lots of things out their diet and they end up affecting the populations of gut bacteria and developing microbiome problems that can lead to things like IBS, but also immune dysfunction and all sorts of other problems.
Chat to me about a microbiome injury. How would our listeners or our viewers know that their microbiome are out of sync or injured?
Yeah, the way that you would experience that would be having these kind of what we would call irritable bowel syndrome type symptoms. So gas, bloating, diarrhea, things like that. And what's really important to know is that sometimes those symptoms are a sign of something more serious. So you must go to your GP if you have what we call a change in bowel habit. So going from constipation to diarrhea, or going from going twice a day to 4 times a day to the toilet, you must go and talk to your GP about that, because sometimes that can be something more serious. But a lot of the times it is just changes in the gut bacteria that have led to an irritable bowel syndrome type picture. And so it's really those kind of day-to-day bowel symptoms that we would expect people to see, and lots of people would experience if they have these kinds of problems.
Because people are embarrassed when the word bowel comes up. Everyone just kind of, you can see them.
Not me.
Listen, we chat Bristol stool charts here in Real Health, so we're all about the poo. But people do get they're embarrassed about it, and if to talk about it, or to if you ask them to, that they should know their bowel habits, that they should know how many times to go to the toilet, they get very shy about it.
Poo shy, yeah. And I think, one thing to say is that when you come and see someone like me, or you go to your GP, we hear about these things all the time. It's our absolute bread and butter of what we talk about. So you mustn't be shy in front of us. If you have things that feel uncomfortable to talk about, it's worth writing them down, and then you can just hand a note to your GP rather than saying it out loud if that feels more comfortable. But genuinely, once you end up in a situation where you're talking to someone like myself, there's nothing I haven't heard before. There's nothing that would shock me. There's nothing that would make me think you are disgusting or anything like that. And I'm probably going to ask you questions about your poo that no one's ever asked you before, and they might feel uncomfortable. But
okay,
what
I have to know what you ask. Come on, tell us.
So I would need to know, for example, obviously how many times a day you go into the toilet, which is an obvious one. I'd like to know about the colour of your poo. I would like to know whether it's particularly foul smelling. I'd like to know if your gas is particularly foul smelling. There's lots of things that people can feel quite uncomfortable about talking about.
Tell us a bit more about what colour poo should be.
So we want your poo to be like a mid-brown colour, almost like a conker brown type colour. That's sort of what we would call normal.
Okay.
If it's a bit lighter than that, that can suggest, but not always, it can suggest that you are not absorbing all the nutrients from your food. So that leads me down a whole other path of trying to think about things like your gallbladder, your pancreas, other organ systems that are really important for breaking down the food and getting it to that mid-brown colour. And then if it's too dark in colour, especially if it's black and sticky, that can suggest that you might have some bleeding in your GI tract, so within your gut, basically, or your stomach. And then that's obviously a medical emergency. So we need to know what the colour is. Sometimes people's poo can be a real pale, like a clay colour, and that suggests that their bile function isn't very good. Sometimes it can be green in colour, which suggests they might have an infection or something like that. So there's lots of things that the colour of poo can tell us about.
Fascinating. That it's in 7 years we've never ever talked about the color of poo, but it makes when you talk through it, it makes total sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes stools can be orange in color and that tells us other things. It's all so important to understand what's going on in someone's, and it just really helps me with my scanning in my brain about which organ systems within the gut are likely to be working or not working as well as they could be, and therefore reaching a diagnosis of what might be going on. And candidly, that diagnosis may well lead me to saying, I need you to go and see your GP, or I need to refer you on to have a medical diagnosis here. But a lot of it we can manage with dietary strategies.
And of course, constipation is something people suffer with time and time again. If people are suffering from constipation, talk me through dietary changes that will be advised for people in that situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a common thing, and it affects 50% more women than men. So it's doubly as common, terrible language, in women as it is in men, which is unfortunate. And I think a part of that is to do with this poo shy stuff we've been talking about not wanting to go to the toilet in front of other people or around other people in offices and things like that. So constipation can be caused by one of two things. So there's basic constipation, where things like kiwis are amazing for constipation. So kiwis contain a special enzyme that helps to improve the contractions in the bowel, so the movement of stool through the gut. So kiwis, 2 kiwis a day, amazing treatment for
skin or no skin?
Doesn't matter. Skin or no skin, doesn't matter, however you prefer them.
Yep.
So soaked chia seeds are amazing for constipation, but never have them dried if you're constipated, because it's going to draw more water from the gut. You want to be introducing more water into the gut through things like chia seeds, psyllium husk, these kinds of fibers that can be really helpful. And of course, generally increasing fruits and vegetables and water intake. But some people, especially midlife or after having a baby for women, you can end up with a type of constipation that's not meaning that the stool is too hard. So it's not that the poo is hard, but it's difficult to pass. The stool's soft, but it's difficult to pass. And that normally tells me that someone's got something going on with their pelvic floor and the strength and muscles of their pelvic floor. So to do with how the rectum and the anus are functioning and whether they are able to effectively expel the stool properly. So I see a lot of patients, it's a real bugbear of mine, I see a lot of patients who've been to their doctor and said, look, I'm really constipated, I can't go to the toilet. And the doctor's telling them to eat more and more and more fiber. But in reality, if there's something wrong with the anus and the rectal muscles and you can't expel that stool, the more fiber you put in, the more uncomfortable you're going to get. So it's not that you should be on a low fiber diet, but definitely that it needs to be managed really differently to kind of a standard constipation.
Wow. And of course, well, anyone who's been through pregnancy, pelvic floor work post pregnancy is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. And also if you've gone through the menopause, even if people have had like a traumatic birth 20 years ago and then they go through the menopause, the pelvic floor weakens. And we talk a lot about urinary incontinence after birth and also after the menopause or during the menopause. But unfortunately, rectal incontinence, so incontinence of poo, is also relatively common or more common than we discuss. But there's loads we can do about it, and nobody has to live with that as a symptom. It's something that we can work on and can be improved. So I see lots of people who've been too embarrassed to come forward about having accidents like that, or who have just been told you just have to live with it, and that's never the case.
Okay, so Kegel and lots of squeezing. For the
Sometimes, Carl, sometimes it's that you're squeezing too much and there's too much tension within the pelvic floor. And this is where my amazing colleagues in pelvic physiotherapy just do an incredible job of helping to train people to use the toilet effectively and expel things properly. And sometimes some people might need some surgeries and things like that to support it, Botox even to relax the rectal muscles. Yep. So it's not as simple, unfortunately. Obviously, we should all be doing our pelvic floor exercises, but sometimes there can be too much tension there and that causes more problems. Note
to self, let's get the number of let's do an app on how to use the toilet properly later on in the podcast series. It's a great topic it's a great title for a podcast. Okay, so moving on, I want to talk about stress now. So we've covered a lot of stuff already so far, which is brilliant. Stress and nutrition and gut health. Chat to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, stress is one of those things that feels just really ubiquitous to us all now as humans, and that's really hard for us to cope with, both physically and emotionally, of course. When we are excessively stressed, it changes the pH of our gut. And if you remember from GCSE science and things like that, different bacteria can thrive or not thrive in certain different sort of acidic or alkaline contents. So we want our stools to remain in a particular pH range. And when we're more stressed, that can be shifted. Our gut bacteria don't like stress. So in times of stress, they almost evolve with us and change in populations to further perpetuate that stress. So like the rest of our body, our interpretation of stress on a biological level is that something terrible has happened. We're going to have to run away or fight, or we're going to have to do things that are really extreme, when in reality lots of us live with this sort of chronic low level stress. Our gut bacteria, when we are chronically stressed, change in populations to do amazing things but detrimental things, like increase how much cortisol we produce in response to stress. And of course that's unhelpful now, but in the past it would have been quite helpful if you were under real danger to increase your stress levels further and be able to fight or run or whatever it was you were needing to do. So it's about, stress management is such an important piece of gut health advice generally, but also in the general population. We do really need to be thinking about strategies to improve stress management. Not only does it have a negative impact on our gut health, of course, but it's also, when we're full of cortisol, so our stress hormone, it's really pro-inflammatory in the body. And we're learning more and more about the negative impact of inflammation on the risk of developing conditions like heart disease, diabetes, which is now considered an inflammatory condition, even things like cancers. We do really want to be working on that stress piece to reduce the impact, not only on our gut health, but on our whole organ systems.
And of course, from an anti-inflammatory perspective, there are certain foods in our diet that we should be eating more of, aren't there?
Yeah, and it's the basics, Carl. It's eating more fruits and vegetables. Having lots of oily fish is really good for anti-inflammatory benefits, and being really careful with those processed and ultra-processed foods, as well as things like alcohol and smoking, of course. It's really not rocket science, and people selling anti-inflammatory protocols and things that feel really difficult and inaccessible are not doing any favors, really. It is just about making those small changes that you would read on an NHS website, for example.
We are seeing lots of that online. The cortisol is one of the, certainly last year, it was last year's buzzword. There was cortisol coaches selling their courses, which is total bullshit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, obviously I would hope that they might be implementing some good stuff, like working on trying out breath work or meditation or yoga, whatever it is, to try and lower your cortisol. But ultimately, people come to me now, even in clinic, and will say, oh, I think my cortisol, I think I've got chronic cortisol overload and adrenal fatigue. And none of it's real. It's all, we're over medicalizing a problem that is not easy to resolve in terms of lifestyle, but metabolically relatively easy to resolve if we could overhaul our lifestyle, which isn't always possible.
It's a good point, that though, isn't it? Like, change is hard. Like, making change, it's not easy, and it's sold as being this easy quick fix and follow my plan, follow my whatever. It actually isn't. It, like, wellness and from a food perspective or a movement perspective, there's a bit of work in it.
Oh, for sure. And there's certainly a big mental load in it, Carl. And I think that's the thing that we sometimes miss. I was away last week doing corporate wellness for a big city company. And the problem is that people having time and space and mental space to think about the small changes that they could be making to nudge things in the right direction. And a lot of my clients are working really hard, have young families, doing all sorts of things, juggling many, many different things. And I think when we see these sort of follow my plan, here's your whole life overhaul, it's just really inaccessible to most people. And obviously the work that we do at City within my company is really just making those small changes and making them accessible and applicable, but also going for that low-hanging fruit, the things that are easy to change and that you could do tomorrow without it feeling like a massive extra stress or an extra thing on your plate.
And following on from that, then, let's chat supplements. Everywhere, sold by everyone, generally without a qualification. What's your take on them?
Listen, I think supplements, when well used and well formulated and appropriate, are really beneficial. The problem that we have, and having worked and formulated supplements for companies, one of the problems that we have is that there's really no regulation in the industry. So anyone can go and make a supplement. A manufacturer will put anything that you want into it, whether it's a dangerous dose or a safe dose, it doesn't really matter. You could go make a supplement tomorrow, Carl, and use your Instagram to sell it. Nobody would stop you. No one's going to check what's in it. No one's going to regulate what you do. The only bit of regulation we have is about what you can say about them. But companies are getting really smart around getting around that legislation now by using words that are similar to the word that you want to use, but not quite. So, for example, you might say, if you're trying to make an anti-inflammatory supplement, you might use, I don't know, flame as a word that people associate with inflammation, but you're not quite using the right word. So it's a complicated space, but supplements can be life-changing for people. They do work in inverted commas. So if we have someone who's iron deficient, we can correct their iron deficiency with supplements. If someone's folate deficiency is deficient, we can correct it with supplements. So they work. It's just about whether things have been oversold, missold, etc., which is rife at the moment, especially currently in the menopause space. I'm lucky at the moment to be working with Which, the Consumer Association people.
Yeah.
And we are reviewing lots of supplements. So we've done things like protein powders and creatine, and we're looking at bioavailability, dose, additives, all those kinds of things. So if you want some reliable information about that, head over that way.
And are they published on the Which website or your Instagram?
Yeah, no, they're not on my Instagram. They should be, Carl, but they are on the Which website.
Get them on your Instagram.
I know. And we've done loads of podcasts about them as well. So I don't want people to cheat on your podcast, but there are podcasts from Which about supplements that we've reviewed.
Oh, okay. We'll folks, if you are listening in, I will find that link and I'll post it on my Instagram after we put this episode out, because I think that's fascinating. And I think it's really good consumer. It's that Which brand, obviously, which is consumer advice by trusted experts. Very clever. There are some supplements that are important, or like vitamin D being one. Obviously, we don't get enough vitamin D from the sun. People are always saying you have to have vitamin. So there are certain supplements that, most people should be on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, vitamin D is the biggie, right? And the government recommends that we should all take vitamin D. It would be my prediction that in the next few years, the government will also say, if you're not eating enough oily fish, so 2 portions of mackerel, salmon, sardines, that kind of thing, 2 portions a week, that you should also be taking an omega-3 supplement. And that needs to be from algae or from fish oil. I've seen lots of people recently taking cod liver oil and thinking that's the right thing, but it's not. So you need to be taking an omega-3 supplement. And that's because of its role in fighting inflammation, preventing dementia, in mental health, in so many areas that, at a country level, we're struggling with. And we just, at population level, do not eat enough oily fish, basically. And I think, in terms of what the government recommends, that's the basics, really, is just vitamin D. But actually, obviously, if you're pregnant or you're breastfeeding, then you want to be thinking about something a bit more comprehensive, especially if you're trying to get pregnant. We need to take folic acid. And as you get older, you may well need things like calcium and other supplements that your GP will prescribe for you.
Talk to me about what excites you now when you look at the space from a dietitian's perspective, about where we're at, where we're going in the future. Like what really gets you excited when you look at the future space of where you work?
Oh, look, I think it's all so exciting, and more research comes out every month, every year, that just gets me more excited. I've just been reading some studies this morning. There was a 2026 study published recently, obviously, that shows that if you just increase your fruit and vegetable consumption by half a portion a day, increase sleep by 5 extra minutes a night, and do 2 minutes of exercise a day, you can increase your life expectancy by a year. And then if you extrapolate that to having a really good quality diet, doing 30 minutes of exercise a day and sleeping for 7 to 8 hours, you can increase your life expectancy by 9 years.
Wow.
That kind of evidence, that kind of research just keeps my excitement for the profession alive, keeps everything moving in our world, and also counteracts so much of this nonsense we see on social media about how, in order to be healthy, you have to, be buying these expensive supplements and doing these things that feel really inaccessible. Actually, the basics are the things we need to do, and the more evidence we have to support that, the better.
It does come back to that, doesn't it? Like we have, like we on the podcast, we choose our guests quite wisely. So we don't bring anyone in peddling something that we don't believe in. It's sustainable. It's real health is what we sell, and is what we believe in here. And our guests kind of reflect that. Every guest we bring in who talks about health pretty much says the same thing.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Like it's not, it's not sexy and it's not rocket science, but they kind of say sleep. I mean, I say to my own clients, sleep better. Look at your sleep. Look at your stress levels. Get outside in nature. Move for 30 minutes a day. But it does come back to that time and time again.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing that I would really like people to take away from this, is that if all the credible people are saying the same thing, listen to them, because we see so much nonsense on social media and elsewhere from people who are trying to sell you something or have a particular axe to grind about something. And ultimately, all of the smart people that you talk to are saying the same thing, but those messages are so muddled up by all the nonsense that we see on social media, etc.
And it's something that I say to people that, like, if you are following a social media account and the reel is like revolutionary or groundbreaking, like, move on.
Absolutely.
Because there are certain signs, aren't there, for that, of people you really shouldn't be buying it from or taking the advice from.
Yeah, and really importantly, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. That's the key. Dietitians and other healthcare professionals will caveat everything, because we know that it's not going to work the same for everybody, or not everybody's bodies are the same. Things aren't safe for everybody. But if it's, people are flogging you things that sound too good to be true, it's because they are.
Oh, Sense and Sensibility. I love it. From a great source. Look, we've covered a lot of ground and some really great content. If people want to follow you on Instagram or book in to see you, where can they get in touch?
Yeah, so on Instagram and other socials, I'm at Sophie Dietitian, and my clinic business is citydietitians.co.uk. We've got a team of amazing dietitians who can look after all kinds of different problems, not just on the gut health front, but elsewhere as well. So yeah, get in touch anytime. Obviously, I'm on LinkedIn and other places like that too.
Amazing. Sophie, thank you so much for joining us. It's been absolutely brilliant to chat. Some great content for our listeners and our viewers, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Folks, that is it for another episode of Real Health. As ever, you know where we are, at Carl Henry PT on Instagram, Real Health at independent.ie, and on the Irish Independent website. If you like what you heard, don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next week. Slán go fóill.